Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back here to today's edition of Advanced Bass Fishing. And man, I really appreciate you guys coming by the channel to hang out with me a little bit and watch the video. Really grateful for that. Never take that for granted. Guys, today we're going to sort of continue the mission we have here on Advanced Bass Fishing by giving you guys high-level information, high-level concepts, things that you don't ever hear about on most bass fishing channels. A lot of the stuff we talk about here on Advanced Bass Fishing, they're not. It's for the long. You're playing the long game here. It's not going to be a quick fix on giving you secret lures or something like that. We're going to sort of like an ongoing classroom, like a master's course in bass fishing. And what I want to talk about today, guys, are the things that actually make a bass bite a lure. The mood and the personality that actually determine how that fish is going to strike the lure. And what this is going to do is, once you understand the mood and the personality of the fish, it allows you to adjust your techniques accordingly. So that's the topic of today's video. Also, guys, real quick, if you want to support Advanced Bass Fishing, if you're getting something out of the videos, the best thing that you guys can do, I know a lot of you guys have already done it, but just go into my description of this video and use and bookmark that Tackle Warehouse link for all your fishing gear purchases. Man, Tackle Warehouse they got trolling motors, depth finders, all type of baits. They got everything you need. So if you guys use and bookmark that link, it's a good way to support the channel. We get a small percentage of a commission on anything you guys buy, so appreciate that. Okay, guys, when you're talking about wanting to become the best angler that you can, from a traditional standpoint, if you want to pursue live scope, then that you don't need to know anything about bass. You really don't. You just need to know how to stare at a live scope screen. But if you want to fish the traditional techniques of bass fishing, which are the most satisfying and rewarding and holistic ways to fish, you got to be a student of the bass. And in order to be a student of the bass, it requires some discipline, because it requires you to be disciplined to pay attention and learn the boring things about fishing, which are bass movement and bass behavior. Sorry about that, guys. I got the neighbor over here. He must be target practicing with his pistol over there. If you hear that gunshot, it's either that or a helicopter coming over. So anyway, you got to become the student in the boring aspects of it. And in my opinion, the foundational playing field that everybody has got to start out in. It's like, if bass anglers were required to go through certain steps, the first thing and the most foremost thing would be to understand everything about a bass as far as their personality and things that cause them to bite a lure. So specifically today's video, guys, I want to talk about the personality traits of a bass that basically make them strike a lure. And in order to get in this, the first thing you have to understand in bass fishing is that most of the time, I'm going to say probably at least 75% of the time, when you get a strike from a bass and when you catch a bass, you caught that bass because that bass was not feeding. It's not because you caught it because the fish was hungry and it saw something that looked like it was good to eat down there and it hit that lure. Because unless you fish at night, most of the time that when you catch a bass is for other reasons. We're going to talk about what makes them hit a lure. Now, going over that, like at night, it's my belief in fishing that I have developed over the years of observation. I think the majority of the feeding goes on at night for bass. I really do. Even all year long, to some extent, especially in the little bit warmer weather months, I think that most of these fish feed at night. And when you catch a bass during the daytime of the year, more than not, it's because those fish are triggered by something else. And the things that trigger those fish to bite, in addition to feeding, are things like reaction and instinct, which has to do with bass attacking something because something's moving past them. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. You got the reaction and instinct. You have curiosity. You have anger. You have competition. Those factors there are the reason that most of the time a bass hits a lure. Now, let's talk about the most, in my opinion, the number one thing that generates a strike from a bass more than anything else. It's because you're capitalizing on the reaction, instinct, and reflex. Because let's say, for example, you're a bass and you're sitting next to a stump in 3 foot of water, and you've already fed for the night. It's like you've got you 4 or 5 crawdads or something, and you're sitting there just chilling out by this stump, and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and all of a sudden you see something darts past you super fast by this stump. Now, as an evolutionary aspect of a fish, designed to just survive, there's an instinctual urge to a fish to try to capitalize on anything that may be food, even if they're not hungry. And what happens is when you bring a lure fast by a stump or something, like that fish is sitting there, let's say, for example, you reel a crankbait past there and that crankbait's moving pretty fast, the bass doesn't have time to think about it. It's like he doesn't have time to think. It's like, oh man, should I bite that even though I'm not hungry? Or is that real or is that not real? Or how hungry I am? He doesn't have time to analyze that. All he has to do is react to it. And that's why the term reaction strike has been created, because a bass is a lot like a cat. Let's say if you're playing with your cat and say your cat's in a playful mood, if you take a ball or something and just move it like that cat a lot of times slaps it. It's the same in a bass. It's like that is what triggers most of the strikes, is that reaction strike from something going past them, and they don't have time to think about it, and they instinctually go out there and hit that. Now, sometimes they hit it hard, sometimes they swipe at it with their mouth shut. Just depends on the level of aggressiveness of that. And that's why in most situations, guys, those reaction lures, like your spinnerbaits, your chatterbaits, topwater lures, crankbaits, lipless crankbaits, swim jigs, anything that you can move through that water column pretty fast, jerk baits even, those are some of the best lures to catch bass on, because you're capitalizing on that reaction strike. And that is if they're in some type of a positive feeding mood, or their aggressiveness levels are, a little bit more. Now, the other things like curiosity and, anger and, all the other factors that we talked about, competition, then the other type of lure categories come into play a little bit. Let's say, for example, let's talk about curiosity. Let's say you're working a shaky head worm or a jig on the bottom, and you're just hopping along the bottom. Now, since this isn't a reaction lure, and since the bait is not moving fast, the bass have time to study it a little bit more. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen this or witnessed bass. It's like that can't dude go over to the shooting range, man. He's got to shoot in the freaking backyard over here. But anyway, let's say that, there's this jig that's on the bottom, and you're a bass and you're swimming down there. Let's say the water's 3 or 4 foot clarity. What happens is that bass, it'll swim down there and it'll go nose up on it, and it'll get that far away from that lure, that shaky head or the jig or the plastic worm, and it'll just look at it a lot of times. And sometimes if you just twitch it just right, or just move it a little bit, a lot of times they will pick up on it and move that worm just off to the side, because they're curious. They really don't know what it is. And that's why a lot of times, you'll feel a strike and you'll set the hook and the fish won't be there, is because they grab it by the tail, grab it by the mid part of the worm, grab it by the chunk or something like that. I've had that happen a ton of different times. And the same deal with anger and curiosity, anger and competition. A lot of times, if you're working that bait, through the water and there's other fish around, a lot of times there's going to be one fish that darts out and gets that lure, even though it's not hungry, even though it's not reacting from a reaction standpoint, even though it's not curious. There's other bass around him. There may be 2 or 3 bass looking at that jig on the bottom, and one of those bass is a little bit more curious and a little bit more competitive than the other, and that competition will allow that bass to hit that lure that normally wouldn't hit the lure if there was not other bass around. And the anger strike that's generated, a lot of times that anger strike is sort of closely tied into a reaction strike. And this has to do with making multiple presentations around pieces of cover, because this is something, I don't know how many times I've done this. Let's say you go back to that same stump we're talking about where that bass is sitting at, not hungry, he's full from feeding at night, and you throw that crankbait past there and it comes right past him and he does nothing. But what happens if you throw that crankbait past there 20 times, and all of a sudden that fish is sitting there looking, and 20 times in a row it sees this crankbait go boot, 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 like 20 casts in a row. Eventually, sometimes you just anger that fish, and it's like, okay, I've had enough of this, I'm going to hit this thing. And this is particularly true in the warmer weather months if you're fishing reaction baits like a crankbait. I remember at the Bassmaster Classic that I almost won in 1998. I finished third behind Denny Brower. Actually would have won the tournament. I lost two big ones. Denny doesn't know how lucky he is. I lost a 4 and a 6 pounder in that tournament. But anyway, that's what happened to me. I was throwing a crankbait down these isolated logs, and I'd never catch one the first 5 or 6 casts. I'd make the same cast down the log like 20 or 30 times, and eventually that fish would hit it. Prime example of a anger strike there. So anyway, guys, without getting a big old honking long video, that's just a few of the higher level aspects of what cause bass to hit a lure. We'll keep digging away at these tips, guys, and I really appreciate you tuning in. We'll see y'all later.